We're going live.
Are we live?
Just clicked go live. Hold on. We're live. Hi.
Okay.
We're sorry for the delay. There was some technical difficulties, but we're finally here. Thanks for bearing with us.
Are we live?
We're live, yeah.
Go live. All right. I just had to send a tweet as well to let everyone know.
All right. So welcome to the Ska Lives panel, the continued legacy of American ska. We're here with the authors of 3 new books on ska. We have Aaron Carnes in the top left corner with In Defense of Ska, Ken Partridge on the bottom left corner, who just put out Hell of a Hat, The Rise of 90s Ska and Swing, and Marc Wasserman right below me, who just released Ska Boom, an American ska and reggae oral history. Welcome, guys. It's going to be fun.
Thanks. Yeah, excited to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So we're going to be...
Sorry, I just want to say thanks to you and Aaron, because I have no idea how you guys just pulled that off.
Same.
Yeah. Appreciate it very much. Thanks a lot,
Well,
Aaron. I know you were sweating. We had you sweating.
We know a little bit more about ska than we do about technology, apparently. So throughout this panel, we're going to be exploring the question, why doesn't ska get credit for being a rich, diverse genre the same way that genres like punk, metal, hip hop, electronic music do? And again, everyone with me right now has a new book out on ska, and you can get all 3 of them in the Brooklyn Vegan store. There's also an option to get a bundle of all 3 for a reduced price, limited time only. And about halfway through this stream, we're going to be announcing the winner of a free Abracadabra album. So if you entered, stay tuned. All right. So just to get started, let's have everybody introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who you are, why you published a book on ska, and some quick background on your book. Aaron, you want to go first?
Sure. I wrote a book called In Defense of Ska. I started it in 2013 and it published in May this year. I've been a journalist, music journalist, since about 2009. I've been a ska fan since the 90s. 1992 is when I first got into ska. I used to play in a ska band in the mid 90s. And I think the more I got into being a music journalist, the more I became aware of how little respect ska was getting from the very people that I worked with, my very industry that I was in, and culture at large too. Like ska just kind of becomes this joke in mainstream culture with people. Just like it's an easy punchline, just make fun of ska. But the ska jokes are always like really centered around this very narrow view of what ska is, and that's that it was, the couple of bands that were big in the 90s, and it completely ignores the vastness of ska, whether it's the Jamaican roots, the two-tone ska, everything that happened in the 80s leading up to the mainstream ska, or even just all the vast underground ska bands during the 90s that existed that were not on MTV, whether it's like Hepcat or Slackers or ME330. So from my view, ska is very diverse, and it's continued on. There's great bands now. There's been great bands for 2 decades. So it's weird that ska is reduced to this like very specific period of 90s jokes. So I just wanted to write this book to say like, hey, ska is this entire genre of really interesting music. And I think that if you look past like the easy jokes, you could actually get something out of it. And if you don't like ska, mainstream ska in the 90s, there's a good chance you'll like other ska bands. Like there's a ska band for everybody, ska haters, there's definitely ska bands that they'll like. So this was sort of the thinking behind why I wrote this book and what I hope it says, because it kind of jumps around. It doesn't really specifically address one time period or one era or one location. It kind of jumps around.
Totally. How about you, Marc?
Well, I'll just say that I heard the Specials' first album when I was 14 in 1979, so that makes me very old. But hearing that album changed my life. And over time, growing up in New Jersey in the 80s, I discovered a New York City ska scene. And by starting to go to those kind of shows, I realized that there was actually American ska. I didn't just have to listen to two-tone bands to get my fix. And after discovering the scene in New York, I helped to start the first band in New Jersey called Bigger Thomas. And so I played in that band for quite a long time. And then after I got married and had a kid and things slowed down a little bit musically, I started to blog about ska. I had a blog called Marco on the Bass that I started in 2010. And it was through that process of sort of trying to just to help other people learn about the American ska scene that I came upon the idea of actually writing a book. I started writing the book in 2018. It took me 3.5 years, but that book is really an extension of the blog. And it's a look at 18 bands and one tour that I feel really don't get the credit that they deserve for a lot of what has come after. So the 90s Ska Boom and what we have today, really the roots of that are all the bands that are in my book who in many cases started playing before the internet. So there was very little evidence that they existed. So my goal really is just to make sure that those bands get the credit they deserve. And if you're interested in where the roots of American ska that are in Aaron and Ken's books come from, then you can read mine.
Yeah.
And those bands are like virtually undocumented prior to now. I mean, the 80s underground scene for other genres have been well documented for decades now. But the scene and the bands that Marc describes are just, it's almost like they didn't exist, is kind of how they've been treated. So now Marc's book is like a full giant encyclopedia of this like previously undocumented scene.
Yeah, and
Totally.
right now, I'll apologize right from the get-go. I'm sorry about the size of the font. I know it's small. And I know for some people have told me that they need reading glasses. I apologize. I really did try to cram as much as I could into that book. So, you know, you might come out with your eyes a little red afterwards, but really the goal was to make sure that those stories all got told.
It's
Nice.
totally worth going blind to read your book, Marc. I'll say.
So Ken, why don't you introduce yourself in your book?
Yeah, so I'm Ken Partridge. I've got a hell of a hat. The rise of 90s ska and swing. Yeah, this is kind of like the music of my teen years. I discovered ska on the last day of middle school when like some friends just like brought in a pile of records for like a field trip on the last day of school or something, and I just kind of fell for it right away and spent the next 4 years kind of going back and learning about two-tone and all that stuff, but also like absorbing all the new stuff that was going on. And yeah, I ended up getting into music journalism post-college, and I think it was always kind of in the back of my mind that I wanted to write a book about this time, just because kind of like what Aaron was saying, it had been so crapped upon for so long, and I felt like people had like never actually kind of looked at people had kind of looked at like why two-tone happened and like what the kind of like social conditions were and like why this music spoke for that time. But I feel like with the ska and to the and with the swing to some extent people like never kind of gave it that same kind of a critical look. So that was kind of I wanted to kind of do that in the book, and then also just kind of tell the stories of these bands, because there's like no book, or there really wasn't a book up to that point that like told the story of like Mustard Plug or Voodoo Glow Skulls or the Slackers. And these are all bands that that I loved then and I still love now, and I just wanted their stories to be out there on a bookshelf somewhere. So
Totally. Now, Ken, to your point, there wasn't really a book about this stuff. Now there are 3. Obviously, I mean, I think that, the 3 of you, it was not a planned thing, to put them all out at the same time. It was really coincidental. So what do you think made 3 different ska books come out within 6 months of one another?
I mean,
I could say that for my, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just say, I think it's just the fact that it was needed, and the fact that it was missing. So all 3 of us picked up on that in our own times, in our own space, in our own ways. So I think the fact that they all landed within 6 months, that's just like blind luck. I mean, I know my book was actually originally slated for 2020, March 2020, which would have been terrible.
Same here, but then the pandemic, yeah.
Yeah, you too, yeah.
The same here, yeah.
So yeah, but just the way publishing works, just things get pushed back. Mark, wasn't your book supposed to come out like last year too? Originally, wasn't that the plan?
That was originally the plan,
Yeah.
but it's writing a book is never goes to plan. I mean, you can map things out, as you both probably know. It just took me a lot longer because mine's an oral history. I really relied on connecting with actual people and then interviewing them and then transcribing those interviews. So it was a lot more work than I would have ever imagined when I had the bright idea to start writing a book. I mean, I don't really think I knew what I was getting myself into. I don't know about you guys, but the first couple months, I was completely terrified. I was like, how am I going to actually do this? This seems impossible, totally impossible.
And my book could have been released like end of 2020, but I think because I had spent like 7 years writing it, I wanted to make sure there was adequate time to promote it and get the word out before it came out. So we pushed it all the way back to May just to give that ample space of time to like talk about it and post about it and get interest kind of going. And fortunately, it was like a very open time for people. People were like open to ska during this, pandemic period. So they like had a growing interest. And then also because 2 other books are doing the same thing as well. New bands are promoting themselves. They're getting interest. You have all kinds of stuff happening. So it created a good environment, but none of that was planned. Like you said, none of us were planned to coordinate. I don't think that it was planned that these bands that were coming out would sort of get interest in their music, and they would be putting out music that would be spreading online in the way that it did. So it was just an interesting period of time for not just the 3 of us, but for just the music that was coming out.
So let's talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
At what point did the 3 of you start to realize that there was this renewed interest in ska on sort of a more mass level than we had seen since the early 2000s?
I know, possibly with that documentary, I think, with Pick It Up Ska in the 90s. I saw, there was that Billboard piece, right, Aaron? I think you had the writer on your
Jessica
show.
Lipsky, yeah, she did a piece, and it was about sort of ska coming back, but it kind of was hooked on the Pick It Up release. But she kind of focused on like LA's scene and some of the more traditional stuff, which actually was a very different focus on what the article you wrote in early 2020 about ska coming back was about. But I think both were valid. They both kind of pointed at different parts of the ska scene that were vibrant and were kind of gaining traction. I noticed when Pick It Up was coming out, what really caught my attention wasn't so much the movie, but the interest in the ska forums on Facebook. That was kind of caught my eye, like, oh, there's all this energy for this movie as it's being made and as it's getting out there with people in the forum, and the way that Taylor was able to kind of get them interested and help with I don't know, all the stuff that you need to do for movies and stuff. But a more tangible thing that really caught my eye was right before the pandemic is I saw Mustard Plug and Toasters, like February 2020. They came to Sacramento where I live, and sold out show, packed. It was like a Tuesday night. And I was talking to Dave and I was just like, wow, this is crazy. He's like, I know, we played in San Francisco last night on a Monday, packed. He's like, I don't understand what's going on. Like, who are all these people? So that was like definitely a moment where I'd already been kind of seeing what was going on online, but to be at that show and both me and him to kind of like observe, like, wow, this is, Mustard Plug and Toasters tour every year. Like, why all of a sudden were they getting more people than like the previous year?
I have a little bit of a different perspective. I mean, having started a blog in 2010, I would say by about 2012 or 2013, I started to notice that the numbers on actual engagement on the posts I was having started to go really, really high, which I couldn't initially explain. But I think because I was writing about bands that I was actually sort of mixing it up. I was writing about bands from the 80s, but I was also trying to be topical at the time. And I just think there wasn't a lot out there on the internet initially. I mean, there were always groups that you could go to, I think, from in the 90s and stuff, but But when I started this blog, I think that it just sort of was one of many places that people could finally go who were really into the music to finally read more about it, engage with other people. So maybe that had something to do with the beginning of this, but I think you're right, Aaron. You know, I mean, Ken, I know you were at Supernova just a couple of weeks ago, and that was, I mean, it looked huge, at least from what I saw on the live stream, right? I mean, the turnout for that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, it was huge. I mean, you know, I was there 2 years ago too, and it was actually, you know, like a pretty solid crowd. Yeah, it was 2018, I guess. So 3 years ago now. But yeah, that was a really solid crowd too. I mean, you know, it was probably not as big as this one, but you know, that sort of core audience, I think, has always been there. And yeah, there were a lot of like younger people that I saw at Supernova this time. So I think like whatever is kind of in the air is, you know, getting around, and it's you know, people are coming to shows, and you know, they're buying records, and all those like bad time records that are like the first pressings are going, you know, they're kind of like, you know, all sold, you know, like within hours. So yeah, it's nice to see that.
I definitely think I was a little skeptical about this at first, but I definitely think the pandemic really accelerated things too, because I mean, while 2020 was happening, I was watching like bands like Band Operation and Catfight suddenly kind of grow their fan base exponentially. And you know, it seemed strange to me because it seems like ska is all about live shows. So it always seems like that's how you grow audiences. So it's odd that in a time where there's no live shows, or why is so much interest in ska. But we have had like I've had multiple guests now on the podcast that have told us that they kind of went away from ska, but then during the pandemic, while they were like, felt like everything felt really dark and like everything was stressful. Like it was almost like everything in them that was like, oh, you know, I'm better than ska, or I'm over ska, or I don't really want people to know I like ska. Like they kind of contended with that feeling. Like a lot of people have said this to me, to where they're just like, I don't care. I like ska. It makes me feel happy. I'm gonna listen to ska. And like some of those people, like they start out with the ska in the 90s that they grew up with, but the algorithms of Spotify are bringing them to new bands, and they're like, this is cool. I love this. This is great. So I think that was happening quite a bit. People were just like, what matters to me? You know, what do I like? I don't care what other people think. And you know, a lot of people like ska when you strip that away.
Yeah, no, that's a big thing, and I think also about the growth of the Ska Network, you know, stuff is just, I think like that's been a huge part of, I think, you know, bringing some of the younger kids into it.
Definitely, yeah.
And if I could kind of piggyback on that, when I had done that article where I interviewed a bunch of the current bands, and I had posed the question to a few of them, you know, like ska is sort of making this comeback during a pandemic, and like you said, Aaron, it's such a live music thing. So talk to me about that. And a lot of these musicians would share similar stories about how like they use this time to kind of network and make these collaborative videos from their homes. You know, like Ken, you pointed out Ska Network, which is of course a huge one, and but even outside of that, like you had like members of like Bite Me Bambi and Half Past Two, or like making a cover together, you know, and it just felt like everybody was really coming together and like strengthening the scene even without live music. And I think it was fascinating to see how that was all happening. But yeah, on that note, why don't like we look a little bit into some of the more recent things that have kind of like, you know, like again, Ska Network, and I think Ska Dream, I think, is another one that's kind of, maybe we could talk a little bit about some of the current things that have been happening that have been sort of bringing together all of this. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Ska Dream is, I think, really big in terms of ska cracking through the fortress of tastemakers who would never consider ska. Now, what the long-term effect of that is, I'm not sure, but because Jeff Rosenstock is a critical indie darling that Pitchfork and Stereogum and all those places love, they're not going to say his ska album sucks. They're going to say, wow, I didn't know ska could sound good when I'm listening to Jeff Rosenstock do it. So that happened. But see, Jeff has said before that it's because of like these new bands. Well, it was because of seeing the new bands like Operation Catbite, like those, like he kind of got renewed interest in it, and also playing in Bruce Lee band. He also told me that they were like listening to a bunch of old ska punk to sort of get ready for that. like last December, and he kind of had a moment too. He's like, but this music is so good. Like, why are we not all talking about how great the ska punk is, so those factors influenced him to want to make Ska Dream. Also, obviously, again, that album never would have happened were it not for a pandemic, because he only made Ska Dream because they couldn't tour on No Dream, and they were sitting there trying to think of the wildest, craziest way to promote No Dream in an era where there's no live music. And that led them to the silly, or what sounds like a silly resolution of creating a ska version of the album, but they ended up, treating it very seriously. So that was a huge thing. And that, pandemic related, really.
Ken and Mark, do you feel like you can pinpoint thing that you saw in recent years that kind of really helped spark this sort of comeback?
Well, I think it's a little interesting that you have these bands that have been out for a long time that still have a very stable fan base. I mean, the Mighty Mighty Bosstones put out a new album earlier this year. It's interesting to watch their fan base grow up with them. Some of those guys are my age, and yet they tend to still have a fan base that in some cases, goes down, to in 20s and 30s fans who are being brought by their older brothers or sisters for these shows. I have to give props to the Slackers, who continue to be, in my mind, like the Grateful Dead of American ska, and they're just road warriors, and they continue to push and have a very fervent fan base. So I think what Aaron just said is very important, but I also think that some of these established bands have been working really hard and hopefully are enjoying some of the benefits of this larger audience that's growing.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, at a thing like, Supernova too, like you can really see that where you had like, back-to-back nights of the Slackers, but you also had all these new bands too. So like, I think the audience is really, I think all the kids, that were there, like, loved Catbite as much as, they loved the Slackers. Like there was no kind of like tribalism among the, I'm sure there was some, some degree of it, but, it seemed like everybody was just kind of there for all the bands. And that was really fun to see.
It's interesting how Mighty Mighty Bosstones' new album it got way more coverage than I think they would have even expected. And it wasn't all good coverage too. There was controversy over the video, but had there not been this much interest in ska, I don't think that would have happened, for better or worse for them. The level of scrutiny that they got over that video was definitely related to the fact that people were paying attention to ska.
Yeah.
Totally. Go on. Yes, go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna say, I think there's something to that, Aaron. I mean, and this may or may not be true, but I think there's a generational situation going on with some of the ska. I mean, I'm a parent to a Gen Z, and what he's into is different than other generations, and I think perhaps there's some of that going on. But what I've always loved about ska is that there tends to be a blending of generations in terms of liking different bands. I mean, I've seen teenagers at Mighty Mighty Bosstones and Slacker shows, and I have seen my impression is that there's probably older folks who are also being drawn to bands like We Are the Union, who have something interesting and a different perspective that I think are bringing people in. So that to me is what's kind of great about the genre in general.
Yeah, for sure. And what Mark said is true. There's been these bands that have been holding it down, not just Slackers and Mighty Mighty Bosstones, but like local bands in different scenes. A lot more trad ska stuff has been kind of more steady. There's also, I think, the Latino scene in LA has been really vibrant, and at a time when this other stuff wasn't given a lot of interest. And I remember when I went down to Ska Wars in 2015, it was like, what most impressed me about it wasn't even so much that there was 3,000 people at this sold out festival, DIY festival. It was that almost all of them were young, and that there was so much youth energy behind it. They knew the bands, they knew the lyrics, they knew everybody. It was a very alive scene, and like, as much as the bands have been holding it down outside of that scene, like that kind of aliveness in a local scene, I think was kind of unique at that time period. And it feels like maybe everyone else in the country is catching up, you know, ska people, to where that's coming back. But that felt like kind of an isolated thing at the time.
So I think, you know, I think we all agree that American ska or third wave ska or ska punk deserves a reevaluation. And I think all three of you are already doing this with your books, podcasts, etc. So I'm wondering, what do you think makes American ska such as a distinct style of its own, separate from two-tone, separate from the Jamaican music, and why is it so special and important to you? Ken, you want to take this one first?
Sure, I could sort of jump in first, since that's kind of the era, or since the
Yeah,
about, you know, like a 90s era. I think part of it is just that it was kind of like, you know, two steps past like the original. So you had like, you know, the first wave Jamaican, obviously, and then with like, you know, two-tone, you had this kind of like giant, you know, population of like West Indian people in the UK. So you had, you know, that was already kind of like that kind of like that sort of like a Jamaican music was already like a known quantity there. There was like reggae songs on the radio all throughout the 60s in the UK. And, you know, two-tone was like really like, you know, black and white kids coming together. But I feel like by the time it gets to, you know, the US, and I'm certainly like in the 90s era, there was like less of that kind of, you know, direct sort of Jamaican connection to it. And so it just kind of became more like hybridized, more, you know, bastardized, some would say, you know, took on more, you know, punk and like metal influences even, and all kinds of other things. So yeah, like I think, you know, like American ska is sort of, you know, characterized by like a willingness to sort of do almost anything to ska. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's like you can, you know, kind of mix like the offbeat, you know, guitar with almost anything, and it could still kind of fall in this, like in the ska family. Like you could have like the Blue Meanies could play on a bill with somehow like Hepcat, and it would kind of make sense in some kind of weird, bizarre way. So yeah, that's kind of what I think is what kind of sets like the American ska kind of apart from all the stuff that came before.
I also think too, and in a way, you could almost say like Jamaican ska, two-tone ska, and then ska for the rest of the world. It's sort of a trueness that like the rest of the world took ska and continued to hybridize it in their own unique ways with their own unique cultures and musical interests, and to a lot of degree, like removed from the original Jamaican version of it. But what's unique about the US is that we have such a bizarre relationship with it, where we like this idea that that we're reevaluating it, that I defended it in my book, that we're all defending it in our own way. That's a very uniquely American concept, because in Latin America, Japan, Europe, they're not all sitting around being embarrassed by ska. It's just a genre. And the way in the US, it's just like, so it almost has this like supremely unpretentious element to it in the US, because it's like such a looked down upon genre, that you talk to ska musicians in this country and they know they're not cool, and they completely embrace it, and they completely love the music, and they completely love what it is they like to do to the music, and all the different directions you can go. So there is like, I think there is a precious element of love that goes into it.
Yeah.
I would say for me and the bands I wrote about in my book, there's a definite love for two-tone, and through that there was I feel like I was sort of brainwashed in a good way by Jerry Dammers and the Specials too, and I've lived my life. I often say that I worship at the Church of Two-Tone, but that hearing that music at 14, 15, 16 completely gave me a perspective and a worldview, which I actually still have to this day. And what I think is interesting about the bands in my book is that many of them came from that same perspective, so that you had more bands with black and white members in the 80s, a little bit more diversity in terms of the makeup of the members of the band. You had a few women here and there, not a lot, but a couple. And what I think is really interesting as it relates to Aaron's book and Ken's book is that the bands in my book really influence the bands that come later. So for instance, Bim Scala Bim from Boston, a direct influence on the Mighty Mighty Bosstones. The Toasters, I mean, influence many, many, many bands because they're one of the first to tour across the country, and in many cases, they're the first ska band to play in some of these cities. There's a band from Northern California called the Uptones, who, the members of Operation Ivy worshipped and actually covered one of their songs on a Rancid album later. So, you do see these, again, the roots of American ska that are these other two books really come about from the bands that are featured in my book. So, and I know, Andrew, you and I talked about this, but I really do believe that without those bands, without the 18 bands in my book who span a lot of different types of, reggae and types of ska, you don't get what comes later in the mid and later 90s and even to this day.
Yeah, I mean, Marc, I think your book almost has done for American ska, like the American ska boom, kind of like what our band Could Be Your Life did for the alternative rock boom. Like that book came out and it was like, oh, if you think this started with Nirvana, it didn't. And it like highlighted all these bands that led up to like Nirvana and the explosion of grunge. I mean, your book's still new, but like, I think, that's what people are going to get from it. They're going to see like, oh, like, if you're wondering like where Real Big Fish and No Doubt came from and stuff, like here are the unsung bands that had to exist for. So I think your book really drives that point home. And I think, like Aaron, you kind of said this, I think a lot of younger people who were not there for it are going to learn a lot of much needed history from
And
Ska
I would
Boom.
just add one more thing. I mean, I believe that Aaron's onto something in terms of his In Defense of Ska, that some musicians are embarrassed by playing ska. But I don't think if you asked anybody that I interviewed in my book, if they were embarrassed about playing ska, that they would say that they were. When I went to see my first ska shows, the people I saw up on stage were really the coolest people I'd ever seen in my life. Seeing the English Beat play, seeing Ranking Roger and Dave Wakeling in person was mind-blowing to me at 18 years of age. I had never seen anyone as cool as Ranking Roger, honestly. So, I do think something happened along the way that gets to where, Aaron picks up the story, and Ken picks up the story as well in terms of the bands. But, I do think it's important to say that the roots of the music, American ska music are based on two-tone, and they're based on Jamaican reggae. There were people in my book who went to Jamaica, white people who went to Jamaica, really pioneers in the 70s. No one had ever seen, white hippies go to Kingston, Jamaica, but they did apprenticeship and learned the music and worshiped the music. So again, a lot of this was based on an appreciation of Jamaican culture and ska and reggae as a Black art form.
Yeah,
So
yeah, definitely.
So let's talk about, go ahead, Ken, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that, I think that stuff like was not as, kind of central to it by the time you get to some of the bands that are in my book, like that, it's sort of, the focus had, shifted a little bit.
So let's talk about how that sort of happened, right? Like, again, Marc, to echo what you said, like, two-tone is so cool. The bands look cool, they dress cool. Like, it's like, if anything, like from my understanding, because obviously I didn't live it, like, if you didn't wear a suit to the show, you could get ridiculed. Like, it's that kind of thing. Like, so like at what point does ska go from being almost intimidatingly cool to this punchline, these, mozzarella stick memes? Like, when do you guys start to notice at what point ska gets the stigma attached to it, and why do you feel that happened?
In my view, we can discuss some points along the way, but to me, the stigma really comes after ska leaves the mainstream. When I was like really into ska in the early 90s, yes, it was not the coolest genre, but I don't feel like it was like something that people were embarrassed about or people were making fun of, maybe like a couple like, tough metalheads would, but it wasn't made fun of in culture. And then it became part of culture. And so while it was part of culture, it was by nature, it was cool, And then once it left culture, then all of a sudden it became mortifyingly embarrassing. And because people look back at the version of it that was in mainstream culture as like isolated, it's just like with no context. Not only were they missing the context of two-tone and Jamaican music and the entire period of the 80s that Marc wrote about, they were missing like kind of why the music was the way it was and why the bands were the way they were. You know, just like it was just like, oh, there's guys in flannel and Hawaiian shirts and goofy hats, and this is really popular with kids in Orange County, and they like checkers, and it's like they took the most superficial elements of it, and then that's how they identified it. But even at the time, the music and the scene was way more complicated than that, and there were parts about it that you could argue were cool and were fine, and existed in the underground just fine alongside these other styles of music. So that just all got magnified after it left. People just kind of were so embarrassed by it and just kind of made fun of it so much that it's like that's the story we're left with. That's why we're all pushing back on it. It's like that's not the story.
Yeah. Well, what about you, Ken? I mean, your book focuses on not only ska but swing, another genre that's got some ridicule
Right.
during the 90s.
Yeah, it's even more hated than ska. Yeah, the thing that I kind of talk about in the book, and it's like my sort of, kind of like overarching theory of, 90s, ska and also swing, is that I think that the late 90s were this kind of like upbeat, positive time. It was, there were no like major, conflicts with any foreign countries. I mean, there's like a few minor things, but the economy was, booming. Things were, it was like this kind of period just before 9/11 where like things were kind of like humming along nicely. And I think that, the kind of ska that was like on the radio and that people kind of look back on was sort of the perfect soundtrack for this era. It was this kind of upbeat, like danceable, the songs weren't all that political. Same with the swing stuff as well. It was sort of, it's like if you look back to the early part of the decade when you had like, the LA riots and, the Gulf War and like a recession, you had, gangster rap and grunge, and it was just kind of like a much like darker time. But, by the kind of second half of the decade, I just kind of feel like the whole mood had kind of shifted. And I mean, some of the bands that I talked to, for the book even talked about this, how like, I think it was Joe from the Boss Tones was saying how like he heard, Time Bomb by Rancid on the radio. And like, he just knew that, okay, like, things are different now. Like things aren't, the stuff that was on like alternative radio, 2 years prior to that. And so I think like in hindsight, people kind of look at this kind of optimistic, upbeat, in some cases kind of like, goofy and, not super serious music as just as like being awful. And that's why it's become, the butt of so many jokes. But I mean, the thing that I would say, I guess, is that like in the same way that, two-tone was like the music for its time and place and all the things that are happening in the UK at that time, I feel like some of this music was kind of the right music for what was happening in America at that time. And am I trying to like, compare, the US in like, 95, 96 to the UK at the time of two-tone is just, it's two totally different situations. So I'm not surprised that there wasn't more like hardcore political music and, songs about people like fighting in the streets, because that, I mean, that was happening in some places in America, but I think for, the kids that were playing in, ska bands, that was not what they saw. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And now, Ken, so again, your book ties ska to swing. The swing revival took place in the 90s around the same time as ska. Both used a lot of horns, but ska, of course, originates in Jamaica. Swing originates in America. Can you talk about the way these genres were intertwined at that time, and what made you do a book that combined them?
Yeah. So, to me, they always kind of seemed like sort of a parallel movements in a lot of ways. Like on a very superficial level, kind of like you said, it's, guys wearing suits, playing horns. So, there was that, like the bands kind of looked the same on some level, but, beyond that, even it was a bunch of, former punk rockers who were like, playing in all these swing bands. They had all, some of the bands that, formed in like the late 80s, like early 90s, had like all been guys that had come out of punk rock. And it's not that different from the people that were playing in ska bands. And, they were like unearthing this kind of old form of music that like nobody really cared about in like decades. And they were trying to put their own spin on it. And, that was kind of in a way what, some of the ska bands were doing. And also there's just like some good, connections, like, like when a ska came out of Jamaica, kind of the main ingredient of it was like the American R&B music that was, being played, down in Jamaica. And, that came out of Jump Blues, which was like the sort of, you know, kind of like after the big band era, you had Jump Blues, which is like, you know, smaller groups that like still had horns and were still, you know, kind of playing this like upbeat dance music. But so like Jump Blues, you know, that kind of became R&B, but you know, that's what all the bands, you know, during the whole like, you know, neo swing thing in the 90s, you know, it was more Jump Blues was like what they were actually playing. It was, you know, called swing, but it wasn't like they were playing like big bands, like, you know, Benny Goodman swing. It was like Jump Blues basically. So yeah, like, you know, Jump Blues becomes R&B, and then that's like the main ingredient of ska in Jamaica. So there's, you know, kind of like a through line with all three of these genres. So yeah, I mean, I felt like there was that, you know, that kind of like justified the comparison, but yeah, just they kind of came up around the same time. They got popular like within a year of each other. You know, the bands played with each other a lot. I think they kind of shared a lot of the same fan base. I mean, in a lot of cases, probably more so on the West Coast, because that's like where the swing, you know, thing really kind of took hold. But yeah.
The story that Marc said, you know, the story of Two Tone is a wonderful, beautiful story. The story of 80s ska that he grew up in was also beautiful too, just that the carried legacy of Two Tone and the sort of racial unity and sort of carrying on that message. But I also want to say that I think that the continued evolution of inclusion that goes on in ska as it's continued on the 90s and to present, I think it's also worth spotlighting, because you see the way that it's like become like is dominated in Latino communities and has been embraced in that and taken that, the message of the lives that they live and stuff like that, and mixing Spanish and English. And then in the present, you see how ska has become a place of a lot of inclusion for LGBTQ and that community. So I think a beautiful thing about ska is that it evolves its message of unity and inclusion as well. And I think that deserves to be highlighted as well, as in terms of how ska grows.
I think that's true. And I think one of the interesting conversations I had with Pauline Black of the Selector once was just sort of about how Two Tone had been successful and how in some cases it had missed the mark. And in her mind, it had missed the mark. It wasn't just supposed to be Black and white people, but it was supposed to be men and women. And I think, you know, one of the things I do try to highlight in my book is that there were a few women in the 80s who were part of the ska scene. But to take what you were saying, Aaron, to, you know, to where we are now, what I'm impressed with and very happy to see is that there are more and more women in 21st century ska bands and leading bands. So for instance, you know, one of my bandmates, Jenny Whiskey, just with 15 other women started a project called Rude Girl Review, who I think,
I mean, that was amazing, by the way, at Supernova. That was far and away the highlight of the festival.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, a lot of those performances at Supernova were great, but for me, they stole the show. But there are lots of other bands now that have women in them or are being led by women. And so that's something where I think, as you were saying, Aaron, the through line from Two Tone being, you know, about inclusion. I'm finally in 2021, we are seeing more women taking a leading role, you know, not just being singers, but playing instruments, or that bands are made up predominantly of women. I think this is also a good sign, and the legacy of Two Tone.
Yeah, I'm sure you've read Pauline Black's memoir, right? That was one of the things I found most striking about her memoir, is she described the feeling of being on tour with these bands, and not only was she surrounded by men, but the level of testosterone around her, I could just feel it, what she was talking about. I was just like, these weren't just guys, these were guys like at the peak of their like testosterone level, just being like, you know, kind of was probably challenging for her to be around that. And the fact that there weren't other women there, or very few, like it just probably made it even worse, you know. And then she was very strong and determined to kind of continue to be part of that when it was not very comfortable, you know, oftentimes. And she likes them, she's friends with them, and not like a criticism of them. It's just more,
Yeah, I mean, if I turn a critical eye to two-tone, it's to what you just said, Aaron, which is in many cases, it's a man's perspective on, living a, economically depressed or racially depressed sort of experience in England that doesn't necessarily take in a woman's perspective. And so, I'm happy to see that I can hear more ska now that has a woman's perspective. And again, that's the beauty of it, is the inclusion and hopefully the diversity that gets pulled through.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think with a lot of the modern bands, I think just the diversity and the inclusiveness is really one of the main things sort of driving, I think, a lot of this renewed interest. It's like I had just spoken to Reed from We Are the Union, and she had said like ska is like the perfect music for like the queer community to sort of latch onto. It's fun, it's joyous, it's defiant. Like what could be better? And it does feel just kind of like the perfect music for this. Like we're obviously living through a lot of like really chaotic, awful stuff right now. I mean, even with ska kind of having this comeback during the pandemic, which, was also sort of had, those protests against, police brutality and here's this music that has historically fought against these things and now is fighting against more injustice, yet sounds so fun and such a pick me up in a year where we're all home alone doing nothing, watching the news, being depressed and dreading what we're going to find out the next day. I mean, ska was a great thing in that time, I think, and continues to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Absolutely.
So on that note, two things. One, I want to say, if you're in the live chat and you have any questions for us, feel free to pose those and we'll try to get to them. And two is it's time to announce the winner for Abracadabra. So it's their new album coming out on Bad Time Records. Or no, it's already out, sorry. And we're giving away a free copy on limited to 100 gold vinyl. The only place to buy it is in the Brooklyn Vegan store. And a free copy is going to Doug Smith. So Doug, if you're watching, you'll be contacted with more information on how to get your record. And if you're not watching, that's too bad. No, I'm just kidding. If you're not watching, you'll still be contacted with information on how to get your record.
Congratulations,
but
Doug.
Congratulations, Doug. We hope you're watching. So yeah. So with the so one thing I wanted to talk about is ska. We talked about with ska, it's been the butt of jokes, but at the same time, like, and we've touched on this for sure, it has such a rich history. Like Aaron, you just contributed to Brooklyn Vegan's list of some essential ska records, and we made the list go from 1964 in Jamaica to 2021 in America, and tried to touch on a lot of other countries and subgenres, and really, like, I think we kind of tried to show like this is a style of music that's kept going for over 50 years. I mean, ska has, I mean, it's a longer history than punk rock and then metal. So talk to me a little bit about, like, as fans, just diving into this rich history of ska, learning about all these different countries and types of bands and all the different styles within ska. Like, what sort of things draw you to this rich history? When you think about ska, like what separates ska from other styles of music?
I want to say first that, like, just to kind of illustrate the vastness of ska, and when you presented the idea of the Brooklyn Vegan list, it started out as going to be 50, and then I submitted my suggestions. I know the other people did too, and it was just like, all right, can we make it 60? How about 64? It's like we kept inching it up just because it's like, 50 is not enough. 64 is not enough. We could have kept going. So,
and we had all those honorable mentions at the bottom, just to kind of be like, like, I mean, we could have made it 100, but it's like you got to stop somewhere. And I felt like better to give a quick shout out than to not. So,
and I tried my best to get a little bit more some of the countries that aren't typically represented, and we got some in there, but there's so much more we could have gotten in there. I think for me, like, I think one of the things that I really like about ska is that you know, it seems to blend so well with other styles of music. And you really see this when you look at ska as a global form of music. You look at how ska is like, you know, mixes with the music of the country of the band that's playing with it. And these elements come out and it just sounds so natural. It sounds so perfect. It sounds like that's how ska was supposed to be. And, you know, some people don't like that about certain ways that people take ska, but I think that is just the beauty of ska. You can have people who are death metal heads and they can mix it with ska. You can have people that are soul music fanatics. You can have like, you know, there's some bands in Europe that they really take the sort of the tradition of like circus music, like Babylon Circus in France, and they mix it with ska in a very natural way, in a really beautiful way. I really think that's just like ska's greatest asset and something that it carries over above all other genres.
Yeah, you know, that's true. Like, I feel like it's all somehow part of the same story, which is like really weird. Like when you think about, you know, like I had a Substack to cover some of the bands that I wasn't able to fit in the book, and I did one about Thumper. They were this kind of Boston area band that mixed a lot of metal with their ska. And just like the fact that, like, you know, Thumper is like, you know, somehow part of the same lineage as like the Skatalites and like, you know, Jimmy Cliff and like Bob Marley. That I think that's like so cool that it can like, you know, stray kind of, you know, so far from the sort of core, you know, thing, but it can still be kind of tied back to the main thing somehow.
Yeah.
I think for me, well, first it was the sound, you know, and at, you know, as a teenager in the early 80s, we didn't have the internet. So it took us a little while to figure out that some of the songs that the two-tone bands were playing were actually covers. And that's how I sort of learned about the Skatalites and Prince Buster and Toots and the Maytals. And that just opened up a whole new world for me to get into ska and then rock steady and then reggae and sort of to learn about the different iterations of the music. But what I was also drawn to was what, you know, the fact is that it's sufferers music, that these are songs about people who are going through tough times. And they're not always love songs. That's what appealed to me in a lot of ways. I was sort of anti-love song as a teenager. I really wanted like to hear what was going on in these different places, whether it was Kingston or London or Birmingham or, you know, New York. That those early songs, you know, all the way from the 60s through the 80s were really about dispatches from the front lines of those different places about what it was like to be a person struggling. So that's always what has stuck with me. And I think for the most part, with most American ska bands, you get a little bit of that. We lost a little bit of that along the way, I think, as Aaron sort of, you know, discusses in Defense of Ska. But the beauty, again, I also agree, is its mutability. You know, you can get a band like Mephistopheles, satanic ska. Who would have ever thought of satanic ska? Or, you know, this can be argued, but a band called the New York Citizens, who very few people are familiar with, may have actually invented skacore, that they did it before the Bosstones. And so again, just these ideas that people would bring in different interests and say, yeah, why can't we play a fuzz, you know, heavy metal guitar over a ska or reggae beat? Yeah, it sounds good. I think that's the American ingenuity that took us to the next place.
Like you have hip hop is a genre that is extremely global, and it, on one hand, people embrace hip hop within their own idioms, and that's what's kind of cool about hip hop. But it always pretty much sounds like hip hop. Like the music itself doesn't have a dramatic change. It's very personal, and it has like a beautiful way that it, you know, adjusts to the person, the expression that they have. The ska is like, it sounds different. The sound of it adjusts to the culture in a way that I don't see elsewhere, you know, so ubiquitously. Yeah.
I might argue that hip hop does do that though.
Do you think so?
But,
I mean, I feel like hip hop sounds like hip hop always.
well, I would not to get into a debate on air,
the music of it, the
think
rapping and the lyricism, that's where it's very unique.
Mhm.
Whatever. We'll argue about
we don't have to get into it, but we'll talk later. But I'll tell you my takes later. But so yeah, and like kind of a similar note. I actually was recently discussing this with Vivian Goldman, who is like an expert on Jamaican music. And we were talking about why is Jamaica, this little island, responsible for so much music. I mean, including hip hop. Like,
Yeah.
if like, I mean, if you have like, you know, the sound systems, like the parties and the toasting in Jamaica, that, you know, DJ Kool Herc brought that to the Bronx and invented hip hop. And you have dub, which, you know, really helped start electronic music. And of course, ska, which we've been talking about, and reggae has been so influential on like Afrobeat and you know, like a lot of like reggaeton, of course, wouldn't exist without reggae. And you start to see all this fusion, and so much of it comes from this one little island. What do you think it is about Jamaican music that has been so appealing on a worldwide level?
I don't know. I mean, many answer I have is just going to be talking out of my ass a little bit, but I think maybe it's the simplicity of it. It's just like it's the simplicity of the rhythm. It's just speaks right to your gut. It's just appealing, and so that rhythm is like it's changed and evolved with the different Jamaican styles, but that's sort of the basis of it, the rhythm.
Yeah.
I don't
All
know
right.
if you guys have a thought on it. It's just
I don't know.
agree
Yeah,
with you. It's mind blowing to think of if you look at the music of modern culture and how much of it stems from Jamaica. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah,
you know,
mind-blowing.
not only electronic music, but remixes. The idea of remixes comes from dub. I mean, it's crazy.
Ken, or go ahead, Mark.
I was just gonna say I'll take a whiff at this. I think that it's the fact that Jamaica, for better or worse, is a mix of cultures. You had African slaves with Irish indentured servants, with British colonials, with there were even Jewish people who from my family who ended up, how they got in Jamaica, I have no idea. But there were Jews in Jamaica, so you had this really crazy mix of cultures. And as Ken was saying earlier, in the 50s, you have lots of Jamaicans worked on ships. And so they would come to New Orleans and they would pick up jump blues records and bring those back to Jamaica. And then they could hear radio from Florida and from the South. And so I just think it was this incredible mix of people that sort of helped invent this music. But I'll go back to what I said earlier, to try and answer your question, Andrew. I think it's sufferers music initially. It is, Bob Marley was the most popular musician at one point in the world. You would see Bob Marley posters all over the world, particularly in Africa, but also in parts of Eastern Europe. I just think it's a message about, sufferers can, to acknowledge that people who don't get the attention they deserve should stand up for what they want.
Yeah, for sure. I think part of it too, in this I'm kind of piggybacks on that, is just that I feel like they kind of like, made something out of nothing. Like, the whole idea of like doing like a version is just because it's like a lot cheaper than like making like a new song to put on the B-side. It's like, we'll just like take the vocal out. Now we've got a new song. We'll have somebody toast over it. Now that's a new song. You know what I mean? So I think some of the stuff was like sort of dictated just by like what was available in Jamaica, and these kind of like innovations were just sort of products of like just that,
No, I think that's a perfect point, Ken, because I remember reading that the original dance hall in Jamaica was because somebody brought a Casio keyboard to Kingston, and they used the preset on the earliest dance hall reggae is the preset on a Casio keyboard. You can actually, I think it was Lee Scratch Perry who did that. But the fact, to your point, you're right. It was simple. Oh, let's just use this and see what we can do. And boom, you have a brand new subgenre of reggae. You have dance hall.
Yeah, it's like, from one, like, basic, track, like you can have like endless, variations of, like a rhythm. It could be like, there's like whole records of just one rhythm with like different things happening over it, and that's amazing.
I think that's such a fascinating thing that like you don't really see much of in American music. But I'm going to ask a question from the chat. What for each of you, what was your first experience with ska?
Okay. My first experience was in 1992 seeing Skank and Pickle a club in Santa Clara called One Step Beyond. And I had no context for it before that. I just was interested in music that was happening at the club level that was not a part of the radio culture. That's where my head was at. I just was like really, really interested in like, what's the stuff that's underneath culture that's happening as a kid. That's what I was. And so seeing Skank and Pickle, I was just like, wow, I can't believe the music of this. It's like very eclectic, it's high energy, but it's not angry. And of course, the stage show, the fact that it was like theatrical, totally just blew my mind. I was just like, I can't believe they have props. I can't believe they have costumes, that they have these bits that they're doing, and it's fun. And it was serious too. Like there would be moments where they would like talk about racism and stuff and be serious. It was like everything I ever wanted at a show. And so that was my first experience. And then it all opened up from there.
How about you, Ken?
Yes, like as I said, it was on the last day of middle school. Some of my friends just brought in like a bunch of albums, and I sort of heard ska for the first time that way, and like spent the last and then sort of spent the next couple months just trying to learn about it. But the first live show that I went to was at it was about 2 months later, like at the end of that summer. It was Spring Heel Jack and Johnny Too Bad and the Strikeouts, who were two fantastic bands out of my home state of Connecticut. And yeah, I was just kind of blown away by like the energy of the show, the suits and like the whole look of it. It was just like so different from what I'd been into. I think I'd been into like the Spin Doctors and like Gin Blossoms before that. So this was like a whole world that I never knew existed. And there were like people in the audience who had the suits and had like creepers and pork pies, and I was like, who are these people? I don't see them walking around at like the store. Like it's like I didn't know where they came from, and I wanted to learn more about this world and like who these people were. And yeah, from then on out, I just spent the next 3 or 4 years going to shows as much as I could, and learning as much as I could about it.
How about you, Mark?
A friend of mine gave me the first Specials record in 9th grade. And hearing that was, I like to call it my lightning bolt moment. I loved it and I was terrified of it at the same time. I had never heard anything like the Specials before in my life. And the fact was, I actually couldn't understand most of what they were saying or singing about, but there was just something about the sound that appealed to me. But really it was, back then, again, no internet. So I got to finally see them on Saturday Night Live in 1980, which was a mind-blowing experience. If you have not gone on YouTube to see the Specials live on Saturday Night Live in 1980, you must. I did speak to a couple of the members of that band, and I will say that there were definitely some substances used that generated that performance, but nevertheless, it is an electrifying performance. And if you were a kid in 15, 16, 17, and you saw that Saturday Night Live performance, you went out and bought the Specials album the next day. It was that powerful. But I'll just add that the first real ska show I saw, and some people might not consider them a ska band, was Madness. I was lucky enough to see Madness in 1983. They had a big hit here in this country called Our House, which really wasn't a ska song, but they were sort of called the ska band. But Our House was on MTV like every hour, the summer of 1983. So getting to see them was not only like seeing a ska band, but it was seeing like a pop band. And so they were, again, the coolest, among the coolest people I'd ever seen live on stage, the way they dressed, the way they moved. So for me, that was it. I was done. Between the Specials and Madness and the English Beat, that was it. I was knocked out.
Awesome. Now, if you had to show ska to someone who's never heard ska before, what's 1 or 2 albums that you would pick?
See, that depends on who the person is.
That makes sense.
So like if we're dealing with like a punk rocker or something, you got to show them like Operation Ivy. If you're dealing with like a soul fanatic, maybe like Hepcat, or maybe you show them some original like Scotalites or something. If you're dealing with somebody who likes, more like new wave or all that stuff, you go with Two Tone. Fishbone is probably a good answer for a multitude of people. if you're dealing with somebody who likes like really, really intense music, maybe we'll even go with like Choking Victim or something. So those I would say some of my main like go-tos depending on the styles that they're interested in. But there are like, that's the cool thing about ska. There's different entry points. You know, you can start at different points and then you can kind of work your way in.
Yeah, I mean, even just in that small list, you see how diverse the genre can sound.
Yeah.
What about you, Mark?
You know, I don't think you can go wrong with any Toots and the Maytals records. I mean, no matter who you are or what kind of music you're into, I just think there's a passion and an energy to their performances, particularly from the 70s. You know, he can sing love songs. He can sing, you know, songs about, having a hard time in life. That speaks to me every time I listen to it. I would say, like Aaron, I would switch it and say it would depend on the day for me, the mood that I'm in. You know, for instance, I might play the Skints for somebody and say who might be a little bit younger, and say, you know, this is a band that you I think will really like, and this is a band that really pays respects to the origins of the music that they play. And on another given day, you know, I might pick the Toasters and just say, here's sort of one of the earliest American ska bands. And the reason I like them is because they mix sort of R&B and rock and roll with ska rhythms. So again, like Aaron said, I think it really depends on the person and the mood that I might be in on that day.
Ken?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like something that would fit in the middle of all the like overlapping circles. I think maybe something like like Hepcat maybe. The band that I've never met somebody who does not like Hepcat or who it doesn't put them in a good mood. So I'll say Right on Time by Hepcat. I think if you don't like that record, you know,
Something wrong with you.
I can't help you. It's over.
Yeah.
And it's good too that there's new bands to point to now, like Catbite is a good example. Like
yeah, Catbite is also
because for some people, the fact is that ska's older music, and to show people that it's not old music, that it's current music. I think that's also sometimes that can be important to somebody's like.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, it's for sure. I think especially if
got
you're
no horns too.
Yeah, I think especially if you're young, right? Like you want to see yourself in the band. You want to be able to go see the band. And you know, like I was spoke to Mike Park about this, and he was like, you know, young kids can go see the Slackers. They'll put on a great show, but like, are young kids gonna feel like it's theirs? You know, like it's like you want that band to be like, this is mine. This is not my parents, not my older siblings. Like, so I think it's great that we do have like, I mean, you know, there's been, of course, the last 20 years has been great ska bands, but it's great that we kind of have like a spotlight shining on so many of them right now, and people can hopefully find like their new favorite band. Now on that note, what do you sort of think or hope is next for ska?
For the genre, I guess.
For the genre or for how people perceive it, or
I was kind of hoping that when everybody decided that they were going to review Jeff's Ska Dream record and that they were going to write their Ska's Back articles, I was kind of hoping that they were going to take a little bit of a risk and review some of the new albums that came out this year. Like, I think the obvious ones would have been We Are the Union and Catbite. Those two records seemed like they were perfect for sort of like the outlets that were, you know, willing to go along with reviewing Ska Dream, and maybe were, you know, like that was a good opening, I feel like. But I didn't really see that opening taken. So I guess part of me hopes that happens, but if that doesn't happen, then I guess the next best option is for the scene to continue to build from the ground up and to not concern itself with the larger culture carrying and just having more and more people come to it. I mean, maybe that's a better option. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like the idea of there being like another wave, you know, like when that talks about, you know, the fourth wave. I don't kind of see that happening in the same way that it did in the 90s, where you see bands that are like all over the radio, or, you know, I would say MTV, but they don't really play videos as much anymore. You know, that like idea of like a monoculture that was, you know, like there 25 years ago. It just like isn't really there anymore. So you know, things are more like compartmentalized, and you know, streaming is kind of the main thing now. So yeah, like I'm not going to kind of hold my breath for like, you know, Catbite, like having a, you know, top 40 hit or something. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly well deserved. I love Catbite. I think they should be doing the Super Bowl halftime show. But yeah, I mean, I think just like if like, you know, Pitchfork would do like a review of, you know, the Bad Operation record or the Catbite record, like just, you know, take it like a little bit more seriously and kind of bump it up to that kind of next level. I think that would be like a real boon for the genre at this point.
I mean, it's Pitchfork reviews some of the most weirdest, obscure, like garage rock and electronic music and stuff. Like
Yeah.
I don't see why there isn't room for that. It's not like everything they review has a large audience.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Ken, you wrote an article on ska for Pitchfork, right? What was that like pitching that?
I did, yeah. It was okay. I mean, it was kind of more about two-tone, and it was kind of talking about like the legacy of two-tone and kind of how like the American ska kind of differed. And it was kind of like the first, you know, kind of thoughts that I had on the subject that would kind of lead to this book in a lot of ways. Yeah, I don't think there was like that much, you know, pushback on it. I mean, I think it was, you know, but again, it was sort of, you know, framed as like, let's talk about the specials, madness. And I think all those bands have always kind of been cool. Like I think really ska kind of took on its bad name, you know, post the bands that I wrote about in my book, unfairly, I would say, but yeah.
a lot of those reviewers, the truth is that they're all like ex-ska fans. And
oh yeah,
they're
absolutely.
embarrassed. They're embarrassed by their own ska roots. So we need
Everybody's got
to
a ska
get them back on to contend with that.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that the Interrupters, love them or hate them, had sort of a moment right before the pandemic.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, one of their songs cracked top 40 radio. Am I wrong?
The alternative chart.
It was on, yeah, it was on alternative radio.
Alternative radio. So, you know, again, love them or hate them, they take on a lot of the trappings of ska bands, you know, and I know they're sort of from the, you know, part of the Rancid universe. But I thought it was interesting that they were drawing in non-ska fans. You know, when I would sort of read online about the Interrupters, it seemed that their fan base was expanding from people who wouldn't necessarily have ever been ska fans previously. So I thought that was interesting. But I sort of agree with Aaron that I hope it doesn't get any bigger. I don't think we need popular culture to pluck a band and say, you know, this is the band of the moment. I'd rather have the scene, you know, the grow organically at the grassroots level and keep regenerating itself. You know, if we can get younger people to love ska music, and this crop of Bad Time Records bands goes out and plays more and more kids get into that, then I think that's a win for ska music in general.
Totally.
Absolutely.
Now, do you think that the fact that ska got so famous in America, do you think that hurt the genre?
It definitely hurt the genre, but it could have been different. This could have been huge in a different way, and I don't think it would have hurt the genre. Like, let's say in an alternative world, Fishbone became the breakout band. You know, like let's say like a song like Unyielding Conditioning, that becomes the breakout ska song. I don't think we would be having this conversation today if that's what led the way to introducing ska in a huge way to the American audience. And I'm not like putting down the bands or the songs that got popular. I'm just saying like that's an undeniably good band, an undeniably good song with a super deep message to it. So, you know, ska needed to be represented in that way to mainstream culture to not have gotten this backlash, I think.
What about the other two? Any thoughts on?
I mean, I don't write about Moon Records in my book. I know, Ken, you do, but I think the fact is that there was an American ska label at one point in time, which attempted, you know, this Herculean effort of trying to sign bands, sell albums, you know, put bands out on the road. Whether or not that contributed to the crash that happened after the boom, I'm not sure, but I've always been impressed by that. You know, it is a very American story. You know, some of the criticism of Moon was that there wasn't a lot of quality control at a certain point on the product that was being released. And maybe that contributed to, you know, Aaron's In Defense of Ska thesis, that there's certainly something to that. Although I think a lot of the Moon bands sort of followed a certain template, but they spawned bands who spawned bands who spawned bands that I think those might be the bands that some of us find embarrassing, right?
What do you think, Ken? Did Ska's fame hurt it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just kind of always a backlash against anything that gets popular. So yeah, I think you could say that, but I think there were like enough people that, you know, got into it, that kind of like dug into it and went, you know, deeper and, you know, learned about the two-tone, learned about the Jamaican stuff, that, you know, I think the fact that we still have a ska scene here, you know, today, I think just kind of like goes to show that people didn't completely abandon it. Like there were the people who were just, you know, casual, like sort of like alt rock listeners who, okay, this week it's the Boss Tones, next week it's going to be Limp Bizkit. Yeah, like those people totally fell off and they probably make fun of it now. But I think that like enough of it kind of like implanted itself into people that you're seeing like multiple generations, you know, that have kind of carried it on.
Yeah, one of the things I enjoyed most about Aaron's book was sort of the outing of famous people who had been in ska bands. I mean, to me, that was one of the most enjoyable aspects of reading your book, Aaron, was Oscar Isaac, Star Wars fame,
Yeah.
ska band, right? I mean, just that whole, there was just, I guess, a period of time, maybe it was just a couple of years, where it was cool to be in a ska band, right?
It's a unique story to ska, this idea that you're trying to hide your history with it and people are outing you. What's really funny though is that in recent years, particularly this year, it's like totally flipped on its side. Like on my podcast, we're getting people who are like wanting to come on the podcast and tell us about their ska roots, almost like they want to be like, yes, I have ska roots. I've always been down. Like it's almost like it's like not how it was like a decade ago, where you wanted to be like, no, I wasn't that into it. I was a kid. You can't judge me.
Well, people
Yeah.
are going to find out sooner or later, so you might as well just come clean with it, I think is what it is. It's like, you know,
And I
we'll
think,
find
you know,
you. We'll find your ska past.
Yeah.
that's right. And I think enough time has passed that, you know, the stigma is kind of so far in the rear view. There's a new generation of music fans who were too young to have known about the stigma in real time.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So it's like, you know, it's a good time to be a ska fan. It's a good time to, you know, like, again, people, it's like, yeah, I'm not embarrassed about it. You're all like, oh yeah, you know what? I did used to love all that stuff. And it's like kind of the right time, I think, I think we're seeing a coinciding of older people who used to like it and left it behind, coming back to it, and then young
Yeah.
people who never knew what people thought about it, coming to it for the first time, and all happening at once.
I think
So yeah,
you're
now
totally
people
right.
want to,
I
yeah,
think you're totally right. It's weird how much people are like coming back to it and coming back to it loudly. I think that's the interesting thing.
yeah.
And I've seen it.
So what? One last thing I'm going to bring up before we call it a night. So we talked a lot about snobbery from outside of the ska community about ska. What about snobbery within the ska community? What have your experiences been like with that?
Controversial. I mean, there are different perspectives on what ska should and shouldn't be. That I think there's like infighting about that. I mean, there's a vein of people who don't like anything that's not pure or two-tone rooted, and then everything that came after that is a bastardization. That seemed to be more of a thing in like early 90s. I feel like it wasn't a huge thing before that, and it wasn't a huge thing by the mid 90s. But there was definitely a period where there was a lot of fighting between the bands that were holding the tradition and the bands that were breaking from tradition. I see a lot less of that now. You know, there's a little bit of infighting. Just it seems to me more like an internet thing. Like just people like to fight on the internet about just splitting hairs about the most minute detail about an opinion. That seems to be more the case now. But back in the early 90s, there was like, you know, fights, dirty looks, you know, just like we don't want you on the show, you know, that kind of stuff.
I think it's an interesting question, Andrew. I know when we spoke on my podcast, we talked a little bit about the 64 album, list that you put together. And I think we both agree that people just love to hate on lists because your list isn't going to be like their list. But I think, I said it then and I'll say it now again, that I think what you're doing at Brooklyn Vegan is important work. There are very few outlets, mainstream or, music outlets that are actually focusing on ska. So I think it's good that you're doing that. I think whenever you shine the light on certain bands, other bands who aren't getting that light are going to be a little bit upset. And in a genre like this, where there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to it, you get people sort of feeling like, well, don't forget that there were bands doing this for a while before some of these Bad Time Records bands came along, or Ska Network came along. But, I think that those Bad Time Record bands and Ska Network are doing something to engage a different type of audience. Ska has become memes. Ska has become online. It's become podcasts. It's now become books. So the culture around ska is changing. And I think, you just get folks sometimes, some my age or some a little bit younger, who are a little bit stuck in what they're used to listening to. And it's just trying to come at the music with open ears, I think, and be open to the new sound of it and accept that and embrace it for the fact that everything's going to change, whether you like it or not. For
sure. What about you, Ken?
Yeah, the idea of there being like a lot of sort of factions in the scene. I remember some of that back in the day. Like, I mean, you'd certainly see like different people if you went to see like, to see like a Less Than Jake or something. And then if you went to see like Stubborn All Stars, there wouldn't be many skinheads at a Less Than Jake show. But I don't know, I'm just thinking about like that Supernova Fest again, to bring it back to that. Like, it was like such a mix of, trad bands and like ska punk bands. And it, seems like for the most part, people are just kind of into all of it. Like, I think, ska has become kind of like so its own little thing that like you almost can't afford to be too sort of like, tribalistic about it. It's like you're like my ska people. So like, we're just gonna, we're all just gonna sit here and like enjoy the same bands and not try to like fight over these like, silly distinctions. And it's like we're all, it's like the ska has become, and it's like, growing again too. But I think for so long it was like, you would like find people who were into it, and it's just like, oh, I'm still like, so happy to meet you. Let's like talk about Hefcat and let's talk about Less Than Jake, because we have this like shared thing. So.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's like, if it's gonna be so hated on by everybody else, you kind of got to band together and
exactly.
So before we call it a night, is there anything any of you would like to bring up that we haven't touched on?
I'm not sure. I don't think I have anything else.
No, I really appreciate you pulling this together, you and Brooklyn Vegan doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, I mean, thanks for being part of it. It's been awesome. I'm glad that we got started, even though it took an extra half hour. Yeah, so
I was going to say, it's nice to talk to not just you, Andrew, but both you and Mark and Kenneth. I've read both of your books twice now. Just wanted to really absorb your guys' points of view, and it's been a pleasure reading both of them and seeing your guys' take on ska, and also all the articles that you've written, Andrew. It's been interesting to read. So
definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I agree. I mean, if you're watching and you haven't read the books, they're all fantastic. They're all very different. I think if you read all three of them, you get a lot of different viewpoints about ska. Yeah, I recommend them a lot. And I'll just add one more time that you can get all three in the Brooklyn Vegan store. It's shop.brooklynvegan.com. There's a ska section. You can browse that. There's a bundle of all three books. Aaron's got them. Those are the books. Yeah, so thanks to everybody who tuned in. Thanks to all of you for coming on and taking the time. It's been a fun chat. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Right.